Welcome, everyone. I'm Janet Carlson. I'm the Faculty Director of the Center to Support Excellence in Teaching, and we're excited to have you join us in this webinar today. We've switched out of the traditional Zoom webinar format because it feels like a good day to be able to see our friends and colleagues. While Christopher's presenting, we encourage you to do what's most comfortable for you. My recommendation is video off, mute on, and switch yourself to speaker view. That way Christopher and his slides will show up well. Before I formally introduce Christopher and the title of his talk, I do want to pause for a moment, especially in light of what Christopher's going to talk about, and acknowledge the horrendous racial hatred and shooting that took place in Buffalo, and remind us that we all have a commitment to each other as human beings. And those of us in education, I think, have a particular commitment to ensuring a safe community for those around us. And at CSET, we take those commitments seriously. I think the work that Christopher is going to share in his talk titled Invisible Yet Hypervisible, Narratives of Minoritized Teachers and Implications for Practice could not be more relevant to us right now. So I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Christopher Cormier. He has been a postdoctoral fellow at the Center to Support Excellence in Teaching this school year, and before that he worked in the Stanford Teacher Education Program as a postdoc. And I'm very excited to share with you that this fall semester he will be on the faculty in the Department of Teaching and Learning at Loyola Marymount University as an associate professor. So his career is off and running, and we are quite fortunate to have him here with us today. Christopher's aiming for a 35 to 45 minute presentation, after which we will use the chat or the raise your hand feature in the reactions to have you voice your questions and comments. And we're hoping to have a fairly interactive last 15-20 minutes of this presentation. And then when the webinar is over completely, probably in the next 24 to 48 hours, there will be a follow-up email that will link you to the video so you can share it with others, as well as some resources that Christopher's pulled together. I'm double checking my notes to see if I'm forgetting to mention anything to you. I think that's enough to get us started. Christopher, are you ready?
Yep.
Okay, turning the mic over to you. Welcome to everyone, ready to learn.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Christopher Cormier, and thank you, Janet, for that warm introduction. I'm going to spend about 35 minutes or so going over a presentation regarding some issues around supporting minoritized teachers and how they're often viewed in school contexts, particularly in the United States. Before I get started, I will share a brief background, is that a lot of education for teachers, and I'm sharing this also because we have a mix of individuals who are working at institutions of higher ed, as well as those who are in school districts. And so I believe that the information I'm providing will be relevant to both of you, depending on where, regardless of where you are working with this group of teachers. A lot of the support that goes for teachers, whether it's in institutions of higher education or it's at the school level, focuses on finding ways to have PD around supporting students of color or minoritized students. And I'll get to why later on I use the term minoritized. One of the things that is lacking and typically non-existent in institutions of higher ed, as well as at the school level, is providing that same level of information as far as from a PD standpoint or ongoing PD about working with colleagues that come from different backgrounds. So there's all this data that we provide about supporting students of color and how to engage with families who come from different racial and different racial, ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. But there is never, I have yet to see any type of engagement to the same level that is talking about how to work with individuals who come from these different environments. And I think that that is where we often have a missing link, because what happens is that we spend so much time trying to recruit this group of teachers, but there's almost never any type of considerations for what type of support that will be used to keep them in the school environments. I was recently in a meeting where I was asked to participate in helping an institution to increase the number of teachers of color. And they said particularly Black teachers. And my question was, that sounds great, but what type of supports are in place to support these teachers while they're at the institution? And no one could answer that for me. They said, oh, we've done training on DEI, but DEI training often does not include issues of racialized experiences, and definitely not for teachers. And so these are the types of considerations that I want us to kind of wrestle with today and discuss, and when we have our question and answer period to engage with. And so I use the term, I often will use the term minoritized and teachers of color interchangeably. The reason that I'm not a big fan of a lot of new quote unquote academic terminology, but minoritized does seem to fit with how we're describing individuals who generally are known as minorities within the United States. Because if we look at the population of students and often individuals broadly within the United States, white people are no longer the racialized majority in the United States. However, individuals who are traditionally known as minorities still face the same type of experiences that they experienced as a minority. So just because they're majority in population, they still don't have levels of institutional power and so many other things and social capital. So we use the term minoritized to highlight that they're no longer a minority, but they still, in essence, are experiencing this, the minority experience, if you will. And so ideally, what we want to engage with today is how do we support teachers of color when they're in schools? And you can also translate this to in your institution of higher education, beyond just recruitment, because recruitment is not enough, because these individuals leave at much higher rates. So if we've spent so much time on recruitment, not enough time on thinking about the toxic work environments that these individuals work in and what they're subjected to. Yet this idea of invisible, yet hypervisible will come to play in a little more engagement and making that a little more clear as we go along today. And so why does teacher race matter? And so there's 4 different aims that, just to give you some context of why it matters. And believe it or not, even though I'm sure that everyone who signed up for this webinar today knows this and is aware, I've been in many situations where individuals don't and will ask, why does it matter? We just need good teachers. Does the race or gender background matter? And it does. And so there's 4 different aims. The social and emotional supportive, that studies have found that students of all races find that teachers of color as more motivating and supportive to their unique academic and social emotional needs than white teachers. And representation matters. We beyond the role model narrative, I don't like in my scholarship to use the term role model, because I feel like role models often positions teachers of color in ways that it doesn't position white teachers. And so, but there is an important aspect to understanding that if you walk into a room, psychologically, it can play a role if you recognize that no one looks like you and you don't have someone who represents you in that space. So for students, even from a psychological standpoint, it can matter. Even though the data here talks about role models, I personally don't use the term for a lot of reasons, and I'd be willing to engage with that more if anyone has any questions when we get to the question and answer period. There's also been studies that have supported that teachers of color are more likely to boost the academic performance, particularly of same racial matching. So generally, if you have teachers who have the same racial identity as the students that they're teaching, that those students often have higher academic performance rates on, particularly on standardized testing. And I know we can debate on the how we feel about standardized testing, but that's still the data. So, and I'm pretty sure I would agree with you with your critique on those tests. And improve school outcomes and transition outcomes, that we know that from the scholarship that there's a decreased level of dropout rates when there's a level of teacher matching of higher rates of particularly Black and brown teachers in US schools. And I always, even in my scholarship, would like to position it based on the area that I'm studying. So if I'm studying outside the US or within the US, I like to be very clear that the context of hence why I'm mentioning US context for this particular presentation. So there's this a concept that I came up with, and I'm not one actually to think of what type of new academic term that I can come up with, but it's interesting that some colleagues and I have a paper that just came out 2 months ago that we coined this term, the glass classroom effect. And it was coined as a result because when we looked at the data, and I'll get back to that. So this idea of this glass classroom was drawn from, I won't get too academic, I'll just say, but it's drawn from some scholars in sociology who developed a concept called this glass escalator effect, where this sociologist named Christine Williams at UT Austin came up with a term called glass escalator effect, where she said that men who work in fields where women are generally traditionally dominant on the workforce are more likely to go further in their career. And another colleague of hers as well, Adai Wingfield, who is at the University of Washington in St. Louis, had criticized her work by saying that what she's saying may very well be true, but that doesn't take into account the experience of Black men who work in such fields. And so she came up with this idea of saying that there's a racialized aspect to this glass escalator effect, that men, of course, when they're in fields that are dominated by a woman workforce, possibly do increase or go further in their career. But that's not so much the case for Black men who work in these environments. And also a colleague of mine, Travis Bristol, discussed this in his work. We're talking about the social experience of Black male teachers and how they're often not valued for anything other than being disciplinarians and role models and cultural brokers, et cetera. And so as a result of all that, and then the data that we found with a study that I did with 10 Black male special education teachers, what I found is that there was often this glass classroom where, hence the term glass classroom effect, where teachers of color are in these classrooms where they're hypervisible. We said, well, what is hypervisible? Well, hypervisible is that, of course, we know they're visible. They're not like Casper or something, but we use the term hypervisible to engage in the way that they are seen only in certain lights. And so when you look at a school, you expect that all teachers are valued for being able to do certain things on campus, to teach content, to be able to bring up concepts that are helping the academic and boost the academic performance of students, even in a school meeting. That's not the case generally for teachers of color. They're often seen as performers, and they distance themselves from white teachers. And they're seen as performers in the way that they're often seen as individuals who are levels of convenience to be cultural brokers, to be translators for families, and to be disciplinarians, to be school coaches, but often their value as what the pedagogical content that they bring is often not valued and not asked. And I've said this in several presentations jokingly, but often seriously, that in my career, I've never really known a Black male to be asked by a white women teacher or a white teacher period to come to their class and model something like the Pythagorean theorem or something. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but from my experience and also the research of hundreds of teachers that I've, particularly teachers of color that I've worked with, generally, that is not the case, that they are called upon when it's time to take on some type of performance task, not so much when it comes to evaluating their pedagogical content. And so this brings me to a forthcoming book that I have in development called The Glass Classroom. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to move around. Wish I can get rid of this while I'm presenting. There we go. A forthcoming book that I have in development called The Glass Classroom, Hypervisibility of Students and Teachers of Color in US Classrooms, where I'm looking at this from an interdisciplinary lens. So I have colleagues from a wide variety of disciplines who are engaging in discussions on how students of color and teachers of color are hypervisible in schools from their own experience and from experience of individuals that they work with. And I have some colleagues in School of Law at Stanford that are writing chapters. I have colleagues in sociology, psychology, really making it an interdisciplinary conversation, because often these conversations are only kind of positioned to one field. So what I'm spending pretty much our time discussing is I wanted to provide some data that gives a voice to teachers of color, but to give it more broadly. So a big bulk of my work has focused particularly on the experiences of Black male teachers in schools. I have done a lot of work, some work that is more broad, and some of my work now is broadening that out a little bit more. So I didn't want to spend our time only focusing on one demographic of teachers. I wanted to be able to engage and have a conversation on the wide net of teachers of color. And so in that case, I'm using as a lens for today a systematic literature review that myself and some colleagues did. It took us 1.5 years to write this and to gather all the data. And the title of that paper is Navigating the Double Bind. We did a systematic review of novice teachers of color in schools, which I think is really important to understand the experiences of teachers of color who are newly minted into the field, because those are the ones that are more likely to leave in a shorter period of time. And so there's 3 key areas that I'll share, and some quotes from some of the participants across a wide variety of culture and ethnic backgrounds and racial backgrounds from this study. So there's 3: the stereotypical expectations regarding curricular and behavioral norms, this attempt to make sense of norms that differ from one's country of origin, which I find extremely important, because often when we have the conversation on teachers of color, it's often non-existent to talk about teachers of color who have immigrated to the United States from other countries, and issues with student sense making. So the first is this stereotypical expectation. And so for each of these, just to give you some context, what I've done is I provided a quote, and I'll give some background on this particular teacher. And then I also made sure to have implications for practice of things that we can all make sure that we're considering, whether you work at a school district, a school, or an institution of higher education. So in this case, there was a Black male named Jamal. It's a Black male special educator. And he said, when asking about his experiences, that he had no interest in controlling his students in order to garner respect. The authors noted that the disconnect between their students' expectation and his stance caused Jamal continued struggles with his classroom management as students challenge his role and use his characterization as soft or effeminate as a rationale to misbehave in class. And so in this case, what we find in this particular study is that Black men are often looked at in schools when a school district or institution of higher education says they need to increase, or we want to increase the number of Black males who work in our schools. Unfortunately, there is an unwritten expectation of what that means, an unwritten ideal of what that means. So generally someone is saying that they want a Black male who will come in as a disciplinarian. They want someone who is cisgendered and follows along the lines of what someone feels is a quote unquote stereotypical Black male. There's often no room in that to understand the nuances and the complexities of what it means to be a Black male, and often those who come from different types of backgrounds. So for him, as a Black male, and from my experience, and even in my own studies, and often my own experiences as a former special education teacher, if you're a Black male and you're in a school and you send a student to the office, then you're seen as someone who can't handle your class, because Black men are expected to be able to handle any type of issue that comes along in their schools, particularly when it comes to dealing with Black males. But that's not the case for other teachers from other racial or gender backgrounds. And so then what are the implications for this? So being open to allow students to critically examine school texts. And the reason I mentioned school texts is because within school texts, we often have a lot of texts in schools that often position Black men in a certain light. And so if we can re-examine the narrative that we're painting of Black men, even in readings that we're having in classes, then maybe Jamal would not have as much of a challenge with being able to be seen in a certain light. And again, and this is something that I'll say and also reiterate at the end of this presentation, is not holding certain expectations for certain groups of teachers, such as Black males as being considered disciplinarians to take on certain tasks, and especially not having them take on those tasks without any extra pay. So what is this about student sense making? So in that same study, another participant said, I'm not gay, but I've been called gay lots of times. One of my students in my pre-algebra class, a Black female named Shanice, asked me if I was gay and asked why, and I asked her why she thought that I was gay. And she said it was because of how I dress, like because I wear Toms and khakis or whatever. I'm not a gangster or rapper. I mean, I'm not an athlete. I'm none of the above, you know? And so in this case, we see again the complexities that a Black male experiences by not fitting this stereotypical norm of what it means to be a Black male. So then he struggles with dealing with his students in questioning his sexuality. And in another case, there was an immigrant teacher from China who said the kids wanted to know why my hair was so straight. They were really curious. They wanted to touch it and find out, where did you come from? What is it like where you used to live? Teach me Chinese language. What was interesting about this shift with this particular participant is that this participant, even though she noticed that the students were intrigued because they had not been around someone who looked like her and came from where she came from, she was open to it. Now, on the flip side, what is not shared here, though, is that how this may change depending on the racialized background of the individual who this happens to. So if this participant was a Black female teacher, that would be problematic because in Black culture, it's something that you just don't walk up to somebody and touch their hair. But in this case, she was open to it. And that's actually something that we addressed in the systematic literature review. And so what are the implications for this based on this, the sense making that students are making when it comes to their teachers of color? Teaching students about the complexity of identities. There's an intersectional component of being a teacher of color, which is something that we often don't talk about. And providing curriculum representation that helps students unlearn the association between dominant identities and authority and expertise, which to me is extremely important. If we can have more visualizations in schools that are showing a wide net of experiences and how teachers of color can work and look in different environments. I walk into a science classroom and all the pictures on the wall are all white men who were scientists, and you don't have anything that's showing anything. Then you find the students find themselves, and even the teacher in many ways, only seeing someone who is a scientist in a certain way. And not recognizing that there are scientists in every racial and ethnic and gender backgrounds. And finally, this idea of othering. One participant from India had said, they consider me white, so I hear stuff all about Black people, negative comments all the time. They forget I'm a minority, and it really bothers me a lot. And so one thing that I find interesting is that when someone visibly does not fit the stereotypical norm of what somebody expects them to look like, and somebody would identify them as white, then in this case, this participant found that she would hear a whole lot of things that she found to be problematic and made her feel uncomfortable. But they were very open to have those conversations, almost like when I've told teachers, pre-service teachers that I've worked with, to kind of stay out of the teacher's lounge. You can really find probably cause you to not want to stay in the classroom much by hearing some of the negative comments that often come around in those. And so what are the implications for this? It's valuing the cultural assets that teachers from other cultures bring to teaching, support all teachers to learn culturally sustaining ways of teaching their students, and ensure norms that are culturally responsive and making those norms very explicit in schools. And lastly is, what are some implications for supporting minoritized teachers? So one of those is creating affinity groups of similar racial and ethnic, gender, and even including around content areas, such as like in special education. And I add that maybe I'm a little biased because of my background in SPED. And so I find also partnering with other organizations that provide mentoring support for teachers of color. One example is Profound Gentlemen. That is an organization that provides coaching and mentoring to male teachers of color across the country. And also I would add that if you're not aware that CSET also has what we have, the Hollyhock Foundation, where once a year, teachers can apply to also receive 2 years of mentoring. And also we bring them to the university for 2 years to do some coaching for 2 weeks in the summer. And do not create certain expectations. Again, I mentioned that I will circle back with this for minoritized teachers. If there are additional ones, then those teachers should be compensated. It is very convenient to ask teachers of color to be even translators to every time that there needs to be something. But if those teachers weren't there, then schools would be forced to hire a translator. And so they should pay the teachers of color for doing that particular job. And valuing the pedagogical expertise of minoritized teachers, not just around issues related to race and culture and linguistic differences, but also around academic content areas as well. And so here is a brief list of resources that I have. There are more, but for sake of our time, these are some that, and what we have is your names and email addresses. And what I've done is, through the years of being in this field and doing the scholarship that I do, I have a list of individuals who are at the school level and also institutions of higher education. And I have, as I have things that come out, I send to the appropriate group. So these articles right here are written for practitioners without a lot of the academic jargon, and also can be used in courses that are teaching pre-service teachers. And so as if you wish, you will get some emails from me as the years go by of additional things that could be used for your own practice and be shared to use around professional development as well. And surprised, I usually, I ended earlier than I thought, I think. So Janet, you tell me. And I surprised myself because I either go too far, so I was trying to speed up. So hopefully we have some nice engagement and time to really chat with one another.
Well, thank you, Christopher. I was just getting ready to let you know that if you wanted to begin wrapping up, so we have time for the Q&A, it was time, but you beat me to it. If you're open to it, folks, we encourage you to turn your video back on. And if you put it in speaker view, maybe go back to gallery view. For those of you that have questions percolating, raise your hand, use the hand raise feature, put it in chat, just call it out. I will give a little bit of wait time to get the comments and questions seated. All right, well, people are thinking, Christopher, as promised, I came prepared with a couple. Preetha beat me to it. Preetha, go ahead, ask your question.
Thank you, Christopher. This was a really interesting talk and appreciate it, and congratulations on your appointment. My question is regards to, you were talking about the experiences and how to support teachers and not to sort of make generalization or stereotype their experiences or what we expect them to believe. So I was wondering whether you're familiar with the article of cultural traits and repertoires of practice by Gutierrez and Rogoff, how they ask us not to look at individual traits and sort of look at it from a cultural historical perspective, and then take all their skills as a sort of repertoire of practice. So I was wondering if you're familiar with that, and how would that reconcile with some of the things you were stating, like, because how do we help someone understand, like if I'm supporting a pre-service teacher or helping some other teachers who are in a similar situation, like I don't know how to support this new teacher of color who's come from Cambodia, I'm just giving an example. So how do we support them? And it was the first thing we look at, you look at common food, flags, like the sort of those common things, and we sort of extrapolate that. And so that's what I was wondering. Like I think joked once with someone, it's Sylvia, that everyone, because I've come from India, everyone thinks I'm vegetarian, and I do not like vegetables, to be the ones I prefer. But I'm always being given that, no, you are a vegetarian. I'm like, no, I'm not. So that's been something I've always, but forget that aside, how do we help someone to help another teacher? Like you have senior teachers who do not know how to help. Because I'm working with a teacher like this who's going through that challenge. So I was just wondering, very practical terms, besides reading your paper, I mean, what else would you offer?
So thank you for that question. I'm not familiar with the study, but I would ask if you could throw it in the chat or email me. That would be extremely helpful, because I would love to read more about their work. to answer your question, which to me is a phenomenal question, I think one of the things that I have shared, particularly at the college level, is if we're going to recruit, let's say we want to get more Native American teachers, which again, one of the challenges we had in this study was that there's almost no papers that dealt with novice Native American teachers. And there's almost no papers that exist on Native American teachers, like in special education. It just, there's very little, not enough at least that we can write a systematic literature review on. Then if we're saying that we want a certain subset of teachers, then how do we prepare the teachers that are working and the administrators to work with that population? So it may not be possible for every single cultural background to understand the cultural nuances, because we would also be saying that they're monolith also, and there's a lot of variability within cultures as well. So just saying, oh, understanding Black people, well, there's a lot of variability that makes it a little complex. I think that there are some ways to do it more strategic though. For example, when I was teaching in Los Angeles years ago, and I was teaching in Los Angeles, the district was having trouble, as they are now even more so, with getting individuals to come to the district. And so what they did was somehow they had a partnership with some group in the Philippines. And they were paying a lot of money, actually, a whole lot of money to bring like, I remember the visa call, everything that they were paying, it was a lot of money. Now their salary wasn't that great, but they brought them over. And I have to say, they were phenomenal teachers, but the school wasn't prepared to understand the cultural nuances that these teachers from the Philippines were dealing with. And so if you're gonna target a certain subpopulation to bring them in, and they were bringing in, a good 25, 30 Filipino teachers across the district, then you know that that's one population, then it would have been helpful to have some ongoing training instead of just a one-time PD on what are some of the things that we can support these teachers when we bring them in. And so I think that that's one way that could be helpful. Again, it's very complex because you can't do that probably for every single group, but you could often ask individuals what would be the levels of support, and that often doesn't happen. So as a teacher of color, you have challenges that you bring up and it becomes very dismissive, that no one seems to care, or they'll say we get to it, but not, and then when they leave, then the question, oh, we did everything we could, so we don't know why they left. When you have data for years of understanding some of the things that they were supportive. So, on another hand, I'll say, even asking individuals, what are the best ways that we can do? And I would say, for me, if I was asked that when I was teaching, the first thing I would say is quit asking me to come in and be the heavy when students are perceived to be acting up. You're teaching a class and students that I don't know, they're sending to me, Black students, because they think that I can relate to these students. And maybe that's true. Maybe there is some truth in that, but I have a class and I'm teaching like everyone else. And so it becomes a disruption to my class. But as teachers of color, what happens for us is that we often question, well, if I send this student away, what's going to happen? And so we deal with it. We allow the disruption to happen in our classes. And so I think those are two particular ways that I think can be beneficial that often don't happen in our school context.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christopher. Laura, what's your question or comment?
Yeah, I want to build off of Christopher, what you were just saying about having teachers. I guess really what I'm asking is about teachers advocating for themselves. You and I have talked a lot about pre-service teachers and their orientations to the world and how eager they are to please a lot of the time. And so thinking about how to help them develop their own advocacy and boundary setting and ways of being and interacting in schools that help them preserve their own sort of energies in the schools. What would be the message for the pre-service teachers who are just coming into the schools and maybe hesitant to advocate in those kinds of ways?
Thank you, Laura. And yes, you're right. We have chatted about this at times. I'll share the answer that I've shared even in classes that we've done together, that I can give some considerations, but it's very challenging to give something prescriptive, and I'll share why. on one hand, I agree 1000% that there should be a way that teachers of color, particularly novice teachers, have a way to advocate and say no. And so if they're being asked to do something, or if they're being, used, or they're not being valued, to be able to say it in a manner where individuals respect it and will refocus their attention to not position them in ways that makes them feel that they have to take on extra things because their job may be in jeopardy. At the same time, unfortunately, there's a catch-22, because in many cases that becomes the case. So if you are on a temporary contract at a district, meaning that there's different levels of contracts that you can often take, at least in California, I can say. So there's a temporary contract that schools used to do a lot of, where what that means is that you don't have the full academic year to be there, that at any point they can get rid of you. At any point, for any reason, they don't have to give you a reason, and based on the ed code. On the other hand, if you're under a probationary contract, they can still get rid of you at the end of the year, but at least you know that you're there for the whole year, and it will take something very serious to get rid of you. So I'm always cautious with teachers to understand that you really have to be careful in understanding how you came into the district and how that can play a role in your dismissal. And for some teachers, that may be a reason, particularly teachers of color, to say, I won't say anything. For other teachers, they're saying that my integrity is too important that if they fire me, they fire me. So I'm cautious, I'm hesitant when I'm dealing with pre-service teachers, even in class that we've taught together, when issues have happened and they've had these types of things, to really look at the bigger picture and say, what can you do or just not do? Sometimes that means not being mindful until you get tenure. And I don't think it's I don't say that in a place of that it's an easy decision. I say it in a place of just, you really have to be careful, because it can put your job in jeopardy. So I don't, even from my own experience, Laura, I left teaching because of these issues and wanted to do research to figure out what are the ways that we best support. So I can't say this is what they should do to stand up for themselves, because I think being a maverick has its own consequences as well too. So I always encourage teachers to be mindful and weigh the pros and the cons and choosing their battles. So there may be one thing that somebody else may be open to you engaging about, or something that's making you feel uncomfortable, and there'll be others that you just brush to the side. But I don't want to present to any of you today that there's a magical answer, because I think that there's many complexities that make this journey in teaching very challenging, which is one thing I'll share. The last thing about this, when I was teaching in STEP, the current director of STEP, Ira, I was sharing with him how, I've shared this actually with Laura too. One of the things that was a struggle for me for years with my teaching of pre-service teachers is, how do I truly share with them, particularly teachers of color, the complexities of teaching and the challenges that happen in schools, but going only so far. Because if I was to completely lay out every single challenge that I experienced in teaching, I'd probably lose my job at the university, because we wouldn't have students. But at the same time, one of the things that I remember you and Ira had shared with me is that also recognizing that there are some great things with teaching. Even being a teacher of color, there are some great things. And so learning to balance that and really allowing teachers to understand that, yeah, there are some great challenges with teaching and even being a teacher of color, but there are also a lot of great benefits and happy moments that I've had in teaching that I can also share with students. So that's the best that I can give without being too prescriptive, I'll say.
Great, thank you so much.
So Christopher, in your talk, you referenced affinity groups. Could you talk a little bit more about how you could see a school leveraging affinity groups to support minoritized teachers, as well as to support their white allies?
Thank you for that, Janet. So an affinity group, and thank you, because I realize you're right. I could have went in a little more context of what those are for those that may not know. An affinity group are groups that are developed where there's a common engagement among the group of individuals that are in it. And that could be race, it can be sexual orientation, it can be, a wide variety of things where there's some type of commonality where individuals are able to come together and support each other. So I can share, for example, when I taught in schools, most of the time I was the only Black male on the whole campus. And in the few years that I wasn't, I was the only one in my own department. And so even if there's somebody else, let's say a Black male that teaches English, well, there's unique experiences with depending on the content area that you're teaching, that can make it more challenging. So a district being able to develop, and an institution of higher education being able to develop an affinity group could provide space for a almost like not the same, but almost like we would say when we have the clubs on campus where students get together and have like the Black Student Union or other types of groups. But if districts can make it so that these teachers have the space to be able to meet, to understand the challenges, that they're not the only one that's facing these, and maybe they can come, and there's power within numbers. So it's different if one teacher who is minoritized goes to the principal or their department chair sharing an issue. It's another thing when you have 10 that are coming and saying it, to whether it's to the district or whether it's to the school. And so what are ways that schools can do that? They can provide once a month, provide subs so that these teachers can get together, because one of the challenges that'll happen is they'll say, we're going to allow you to have an affinity group, but it needs to be done after school. It needs to be done not on time, that we're paying for it. And there needs to be a way that the school district is able to show that we fully support you all getting together, and we'll do whatever it takes. And one of the biggest ways that districts show that is through their pockets. And so I think those affinity groups can be beneficial, because it can allow a group of teachers to know that they're not the only ones experiencing it and have a voice in numbers. And I can also say that for white teachers who are there, like I know in STEP, there was a group called Critical White Educators or something like that. Laura, help me out. I can't remember the name, but there was a group of white teachers that were able to get together and talk about how they wanted to be able to provide space for not only students, but also teachers. So we would want to look at affinity groups, and not only saying that they're only based on either just race or linguistic differences, but how can broadly you can have these groups so everyone can come to the table to be able to support one another. So a wide variety of groups, and then maybe also a time where if there's 4 groups, that the school or the district often provides another time where all these groups are able to get together, and not telling them do it after school or do it at 7 a.m. before school starts.
An important theme I hear throughout your talk and how you're responding to the questions is the need for us to think about the profession differently and what it means to uphold the characteristics of a profession, and so that people with power and leadership responsibilities don't just add on. Instead, they reconfigure how resources are used so that minoritized teachers are no longer minoritized, that there isn't the segregation, that we do develop affinities and allyships that support the teaching population as well as our students. So am I hearing that right? Is that a theme throughout a number of the examples and ideas that you've shared with us?
Yes, and one thing I'll piggyback on what you just shared is that we are already, as teachers, we're working in silos. We're working by ourselves. And so that becomes even more of a challenge when you're working by yourself and you're walking through the halls and you don't have someone who understands your unique experiences. And so having some ways of getting individuals together, and it is just another way to create a profession where we're working more together, because in teaching, that's one of the biggest challenges. And one of the things I can say is that beyond a lot of these issues that happen in schools, even when I share, like, for example, if I was to say special education, and that's always my lens because that's the area that I know the best, there's unique challenges that special education teachers face, or math teachers face, or English teachers face. But those challenges become exacerbated when you're a teacher of color. And so those are the things that I'm trying to highlight, that yes, all teachers face certain challenges. We work in silos, we have these things, but then how is that worse when your identity is seen in a certain light? And also when these teachers of color go into the lounge or go to the meetings, and there's comments that are clearly racist about students. So other teachers will make comments about a student or about that student's family. And I know from my experience and teachers that I've interviewed, they have found it often hurtful, because even though they're not saying it about them, well, they see that comment as a reflection of them because of their own, who they are and their own identity or how they grew up. Because teaching often it is a very middle-class type of attitudes towards how teachers even engage with students, or the expectations that we have towards students.
Good elaboration, thank you. I think one more thing I want to push you on, because you gave us the invitation during your talk. Say a little bit more about why you don't engage with the concept of role models.
Thank you. I knew Janet would circle back to that, so thank you. I have a problem with how we position the term role models and why we want teachers of color. Because what happens is, on every call that I've seen about getting teachers of color, and here's the challenge too, generally most calls to get teachers of color, even at the federal level, have been about Black men. You don't find it when, and that's a problem too, that we need teachers of color around a wide variety of cultural and linguistic and racialized backgrounds. But generally, when we say we want teachers of color, there's always this position that we need more Black men in schools. And so what happens is they'll say that we need these teachers in schools to be role models. Well, the question becomes, what does that mean? Well, it means that hopefully seeing a Black male who is defying this stereotypical notion of what it means to be a Black male by being in a school, by being a teacher, will help these students to think differently about themselves. I wouldn't deny that. I wouldn't deny that that is not a potential reality. But what the challenge creates is that it positions Black males in schools to be hired for a job beyond teaching. So when they're hiring white teachers, when we're hiring any other group of teachers, we're not asking them to be teachers and on top of that, do all these other tasks. Even though it's kind of written into the rule. We know that being a teacher, you often take on a job of a therapist, of a nurse, of all, we know that kind of comes with the job, but we often don't position other groups of teachers to take on role model type of responsibilities, such as being a disciplinarian or being a cultural broker or all these other things, and they're not getting paid more for it. And so I've seen some colleagues that I've tried to push. Usually it works more in a private school than a public school because it's usually a set amount, but to push to say, I want more money for taking on these responsibilities. And I've often seen it also in higher education where some colleagues of mine have come into a faculty role and asked for more money as a result of knowing that they were going to be asked to take on these additional responsibilities. So I wouldn't say that the term role model is not a real term or can't be valid. The push that I have with it is that we're positioning teachers to something that we're not asking other teachers to do. And it's not written in the job description. So we'll say that we want be a role model, but within the job description, what you're being evaluated on is not being a role model. However, if a teacher of color, particularly Black male, doesn't follow through with those things, just like we saw with Jamal in the quote, then they're being viewed as you're not an effective teacher, even though that's not part of the job description. If I'm making sense. Hopefully I'm clear with that.
No, I appreciate that elaboration. I think the role model label can get trivialized quickly, yes. And then it's an extractive way that we treat our minoritized and particularly Black male teachers. So I appreciate the elaboration. Yeah, look at David's comment in the chat, says, yes. the official translator. Yep.
Thank you so much.
That's another way we do this. And David, thanks for already imagining what my next question was going to be, and that was to open it back up to the group that's present to see what additional comments and questions you have. It doesn't have to be a question directly to Christopher. It can be something that's been spurred in your thinking, and you'd like the opportunity to share it with the group. David, go ahead.
Okay, since we're on the topic, and it kind of, I'm in a small rural high school in Northern California, and my colleagues are mostly white teachers, except for one other Spanish teacher who's also Mexican. But how do I encourage or inform my colleagues to look at the world through another lens, to possibly see how what they are presenting might be considered offensive, racially, or insensitive to other people's cultural backgrounds at home? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I'm thinking of how I want to respond. That's a great question. And I'm going to respond in a similar way that I did with my colleague, Laura, that I agree 100% that particularly teachers of color find themselves in situations where they're in a meeting and somebody says something that they'll say is not offensive, or they'll say that someone who engages in a certain way that's out of school, someone will say, well, that's how they are, but they don't mean it, or they don't mean anything by it, which I had something like that happen yesterday. And just like with Laura's question, I find that it's a catch-22 for teachers of color, because when you tell people that you find something they say offensive, then they find that offensive, or they so you know, you're darned if you do, you darned if you don't. And so I you know, I've gotten to a point in my career where I just say it and worry about the consequences later. But I'm not saying that, but I've shared with my pre-service teachers that I've worked with, that comes at a cost. It comes at a cost, and you have to be willing to deal with whatever consequences come with that type of with what's seen as abruptness, or it's seen as you being combative just because you're saying something offensive. You know, so if I tell someone that saying, I was in a meeting once and the comment, don't drink the Kool-Aid came up. I found the term offensive for a few reasons. One, I found it offensive because Kool-Aid is often something that's associated with Black culture, one. I found it also offensive because the term comes from the massacre at Jamestown, where it's about suicide. So we're making light of people who have, you know, taken their life, which I don't find jokingly, but the thing is that in our society, it's a term that's used as a joke. And so I wish I had a better answer for you, David, but.
Well, let me build on what you're saying, Christopher, because I think there's a type of fork in the road when those comments come up. And one is when they come up from thoughtless, unaware, non-reflective colleagues who aren't interested in
yes,
improving their way of functioning in the world and honoring their colleagues. The other is when they come up from a group or even an individual colleague who said, I want to be a better anti-racist. I want to be an ally, but I'm enculturated and I have to unlearn things. And knowing that where we are in that fork in the road, I think changes the choices we have in how we proceed, in our ability to call each other out. So that's where I would kind of throw it back to you and say, is there any readiness? Has anyone expressed something? Because I don't think the burden's on you, but has anyone said, how could we do this better, and opened a door?
Yes, but I can say, and I would be interested in knowing any other teachers of color on the call and their experience. I can say from mine and for research that I've done with other teachers, it more times than not, it's usually that the individual is seen as combative by bringing it up.
Not denying that. I just think your choices get nuanced.
Yes,
if the door's been opened.
yes, I agree. No, I agree. And so to answer that, I have had colleagues in my career, even as early as now, I can say that when I've had conversations, or even a group of colleagues that have really been open. I can say this, and I don't know if anyone from Loyal is here, but I can say this on a positive note, that I've had conversations in the new job that I'm going with, and they've been extremely open to conversations about these things. And I haven't gotten the impression that anyone finds it offensive. I've actually been asked, you know, can you provide some extra stuff that we can read, whether it's yours or something else? So so to answer that, yes, it does happen. And it's great when it does, because it doesn't, you don't feel that someone is going to get offended, or someone they're really open to, I want to learn, and I realize that I haven't done it, or I didn't realize that what I was sharing with the students or not sharing was offensive. So yes, I agree. And there are hard times where there's that fork in the road, but yes, it does happen where people are open. And I've had that even at Stanford too. So I don't want to give the impression at Stanford that they're having, Laura and I, and I'm pretty sure she'd be okay with sharing this, we've taught several classes together, and we've engaged several times, not about something she said is being offensive, because that's never happened, but just how do we engage with students, and how do we engage in a way to provide more information about cultural nuances. And she's been extremely open to that. And so that, I don't get a lot of, I've had more colleagues where that's not been the case than I've had it where everyone's not Laura. So, that's the case for me.
Any final thoughts from anyone else? I'd love to hear your perspectives on these topics. Well, I want to close by thanking Christopher for sharing his research and thinking with us, but thanking all of you for sharing your thoughts and your time with us, and most especially for sharing your commitment to trying to make K-12 education a better place for everyone, teachers and students alike. So thank you all. Bye-bye.